Amelia Stories, Chapter 2, Section 1, Phil Meets Mitzi. Amelia got off the bus, waved goodbye, and then turned to find that crazy sailor standing there looking like a lost puppy. She said to him, "Did you get on the wrong bus?" He shook his head no after a moment, then asked, "Do you even live around here?" She already knew the answer. He didn't. She knew everybody that lived on Blue Hill Avenue, or so she thought. Phil was stunned because she was speaking to him. He just shook his head and then tried to mumble something intelligible, only to blurt out, "No, I just wanted to make sure you got home all right without an escort," which was the truth. Amelia sized him up and then figured she'd have an easier time with him next to her than skulking around behind her like he did before. What she said to me was that she felt him walking behind her towards the bus. But standing there looking at him, she quickly realized he wasn't going to hurt her. She couldn't put it into words. She just trusted her gut. "All right, you can walk me home, but keep your distance and keep your hands where I can see him." She said that mostly for him. Phil smiled because he was in. Amelia Stories, Chapter 2, Section 2, Phil Meets Mitzi. Phil walked with Amelia in silence for a while. As he later said, "I had no idea what the hell to talk to her about." They walked for a bit more and got to the edge of where Blue Hill Ave and Warren Ave met, and it was Amelia that actually broke the silence, and she said, "Just so you know, I've got 2 kids and I don't date servicemen." Phil smiled and replied quickly, "Lucky for me, I love kids and I was discharged 5 months ago." Without missing a beat, Amelia asked why, thinking he'd been kicked out, and then Phil explained what happened on the Arizona. As they were crossing Howland Street, she stopped him in mid-sentence and then said to him, "This is my street. I can get home from here. Thank you very much, Mr. Harris." Phil's heart was racing. This was his chance. So he asked, "Can I see you again?" And Amelia was clear, "No, Mr. Harris, but thank you very much for walking me home." And then she turned on her heel and walked away. Phil was dejected, but accepted her response, and they parted company. Amelia Stories, Chapter 2, Section 3, Phil Meets Mitzi. Amelia walked down Howland Ave, certain in the knowledge that Phil wasn't going to follow her and that she'd been clear with him. That was that as far as she was concerned. Phil, on the other hand, stood there watching her walk away. He had high hopes of walking her home and getting a date or a phone number or something, but the woman of his dreams just walked out of his life. She didn't want to see him or date him. Obviously, he was a little sad, and he was also cold. He needed to find some place to sleep. The buses had all stopped running, and the taxi cabs were scarce, and there were no boarding houses anywhere that he could see. He had all this back pay in his pocket and no place to sleep. So he found a merchant's stoop and curled up for a few hours, vowing to leave at first light. It was at this point that I said to him, "But Grandpa, how did you guys end up together if she didn't want to see you?" And that's when he said to me, "Fate lent a hand, and some books gave us a good shove." Amelia Stories, Chapter 2, Section 4, Phil Meets Mitzi. Phil woke to a dog licking his face and a man standing over him with a broomstick in his hand. "You look like you needed some sleep there, sailor," said the merchant. Phil got to his feet quickly. "I'm sorry for sleeping on your doorstep. There were no more cabs," and the shopkeeper just raised his hand. "It's all right, sailor. What ship are you with? I got a son in the Navy." Phil told him the story of the Arizona and his discharge. The shopkeeper was the local grocer and had made some coffee for himself and then offered some to Phil while he was telling his tale. The 2 men talked a while, and then Phil said goodbye, knowing that he needed to get back to the base to do some discharge paperwork. He exited the store, turned the corner back towards the bus stop, and without really looking, ran right into Amelia and her 2 kids, knocking her down and her daughter. Amelia Stories, Chapter 2, Section 5, Phil Meets Mitzi. Amelia had to get to work, but first she had to get her kids to school just up the street. She had her purse over one shoulder and a bag over the other while she held hands with her kids, listening to Richard, her son, tell the story of his art class. She wasn't really looking where she was going and ran right into the brick wall of a man as she turned the corner to Howland Ave. Amelia was knocked backwards and dropped her purse and bag. Her son, Richard, just sidestepped the strange man, and her daughter, Joni, got the full brunt of the impact. "Oh my God," she heard. "I'm so sorry," said her voice. Joni's books and papers went everywhere. She didn't really see who it was. All she saw was a flash of white cloth, and then she was on the ground. For just a moment, she thought Joni had been hurt, but then she realized she was laughing. The man in white was racing all over the street to pick up Joni's papers. Amelia recognized the man that knocked her down. It was that crazy sailor. Amelia Stories, Chapter 2, Section 6, Phil Meets Mitzi. Phil got all the girls' papers and books and delivered them back to her. He looked up to see Amelia dusting herself off and standing up. He was mortified. He quickly realized that this was her family. She must be walking them to school. Amelia did not look happy with him. It was her son Richard, on the other hand, that introduced himself. "I'm Richard. This is my sister Joni. You're a sailor. What ship are you on?" He was fascinated with anything that had to do with Navy ships. As Phil was about to answer, Amelia interjected and said that they didn't need to bother this gentleman. As she was about to say something else, it was Joni that changed everything. She had her books and papers back and just looked at the man and then said, "Thank you." It was the way that she said, "Thank you," that changed everything. Phil got down on one knee and apologized and said, "I'm sorry, Missy Joni." And then she smiled. Phil told me that my mother had a way about her. Charming met charming, and he totally fell for it. Amelia Stories, Chapter 2, Section 7, Phil Meets Mitzi. Joni, or Missy Joni, as she would be called, which would later morph into Mitzi because one of her adopted brothers couldn't pronounce the S of Missy, so it became Mitzi. Mitzi took command of the situation and said to Phil, "You can walk me to school and make up for all that knocking me down business and then making me drop my books." As she did, she took Phil's hand and the two of them walked off, with Amelia standing there in absolute amazement. Her daughter had outflanked her. Mitzi was a precocious 12 going on 15. Mitzi asked Phil about living on board a ship and what it was like, with Richard chiming in and asking for details about the guns and whatnot. He told her what it was like. It was just like living in her house. They had bedrooms and bathrooms and kitchens and even play places, just like they did in her house. It was just that it was at sea for many months. "Don't you get homesick?" she asked. Phil answered, "Sometimes, but I have friends on the ship that make things a little bit better." Richard asked what he did, but before Phil could answer, they were already at the school. Amelia Stories, Chapter 2, Section 8, Phil Meets Mitzi. Amelia was trying to rush her kids inside. She was late for work, and the school bell had just rung. Phil was saying goodbye and starting to walk away, and that's when my mother said she saw a glint in Phil's eye. The way that he looked at her reminded her of the way that Papa used to look at Mama. Mitzi knew that her Mama wasn't happy since Papa had gone missing. She told me that my grandmother went out with other men, and she always came home sad. My grandmother said that her daughter could size up a guy in about 10 seconds. If Joni didn't like the guy, then it probably wasn't going to work out. Joni was usually right. "Mama, can Phil walk us home from school?" Mitzi asked. Amelia just about coughed up a lung. Her daughter rarely, if ever, liked the men that she dated and never asked to spend time with them. Joni had just picked a guy that her mother not only did not want to date, but had already told that she wouldn't. And now she was asking to have Phil walk her home from school. Amelia Stories, Chapter 2, Section 9, Phil Meets Mitzi. What was Amelia supposed to say to that one? Phil chimed in with, "I had nothing better to do, and it would be my honor, Missy Joni, to walk you home. That if it's okay with your mama." Amelia needed to get to work, and she had no time to disappoint or to argue. She looked at her watch, checked her gut, and then relented. Joni and Richard howled. Her kids were happy, and they made arrangements to meet later on. When the kids were gone and they were racing for the bus, Amelia turned to him and said, "What are you trying to pull? I told you, we're not going to date." Phil told her the truth. "I'm not trying to pull anything. You have a beautiful family, Amelia, and I have nothing better to do, so it's no trouble for me to walk them home today." Amelia glared at him and was in line to get on the bus. "I'm calling my sister later on to get the kids, so don't even bother." All Phil said to her was, "That's not right to disappoint your daughter. I'll be there, like I said." Amelia got on the bus frustrated. That man was going to be insanely difficult to get rid of. Amelia Stories, Chapter 2, Section 10, Phil Meets Mitzi. Amelia got to her first job on time. Got done and then went to her second one. As she was walking in the door, her employer called from the kitchen. It was her sister on the phone. Something must be wrong. "Amelia?" She heard her sister's voice. It was weak and raspy. I think I'm sick. I don't want to give it to the kids. Can you get them from school today?" My grandmother rarely swore. She chided me on more than a few occasions for using foul language. This was one of those times that she actually said out loud, "Shit." "I'll ask and see what I can do. I'll be over later. Do you need anything?" Her sister said she was making soup and not to worry. Faced with her sister not being able to pick up the kids and that crazy sailor doing it, she asked for time off to get her kids. Her employer agreed and let her out early with the proviso to come back in time to serve. Amelia agreed and ran out the door to get her kids from school.